Hello, and welcome to Find Your Voice, where we interview thought leaders from our community at Podcast Guesting Pro. I'm Cassie Welford, and today I have the pleasure of speaking with Jeffrey Deskovic, who is a wrongful conviction expert as well as an attorney, speaker, exoneree, and the founder of the Jeffrey Deskovic Foundation for Justice. After being wrongfully convicted as a teenager, Jeff spent 16 years in prison for a crime that he did not commit before being exonerated through DNA testing. Since then, he has dedicated his life to freeing innocent people, reforming the laws that allow wrongful convictions to happen, and helping the justice system to get it right first time. Jeff, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. Really looking forward to getting to know you and your story and about the work that you're doing. So you spent 16 years in prison for a crime that you did not commit before DNA testing proved your innocence. When you look back now, what were the key failures in the system that allowed your wrongful conviction to happen?
Without a doubt, downplaying the DNA testing, which excluded me after I was arrested, but prior to the trial, there was a coerced false confession which was extracted from me. That was done without recording, so the failure of the system to mandate that in all interrogations be videotaped from beginning to end was definitely another failure. The public defender that I had essentially didn't defend me, so bad lawyering. There was prosecutorial misconduct involved as well, and then the judge was biased. So all those factors worked together, which resulted in my being wrongfully convicted for murder and rape, which I didn't commit. As you point out, I spent 16 years in prison, but from age 17 to 32 before I was exonerated through further DNA testing. Again, of my innocence, but also identified the actual perpetrator whose DNA was only there in the data bank because free while I was doing time for his crime. He killed a second victim just 3.5 years later who was a school teacher and who had 3 children.
Oh, thank you for sharing that, Jeff. And I can begin to imagine the impact of how that has shaped your life. But this is what we're here to find out more about. Could you walk us through the moment that you first realized that your confession was coerced and how that shaped your path to advocacy?
Well, I mean, right after I gave the coerced false confession, I was aware that it was coerced. But just to provide a little bit of context, I got on the police radar because the police interviewed many students from the high school, and some of them told the police they might want to speak with me because I didn't quite fit in. So that got me on their radar. An additional factor is that I was a sensitive teenager. This was my first brush with death, and I had an emotional reaction. And the cops thought that my emotional reaction was disproportionate to what my relationship with the victim was, which is to say, really, no relationship. She was in 2 of my classes as a freshman, 1 as a sophomore. I knew her name. She knew mine. That was really the extent of it. They got a psychological profile from the NYPD, which purported to have the psychological characteristics of the perpetrator. And I had the misfortune of matching that. So that was a reinforcing factor. So for the next 6 weeks, the police played this cat and mouse game with me in which half the time they would speak to me like I was a suspect. And when they would push too hard and I'd want to get away from them, Jeff as this junior detective helper theme was developed. So they would say things like, the kids won't talk freely around us, but they will around you. Let us know if you hear any rumors. Stop in from time to time. They would ask me opinion questions and congratulate me that my opinion was correct. Prior to being a teenager, I wanted to be a cop when I grew up. So this unexpected early opportunity to do this quasi-police work, along with my age, 16, was how they were able to pull the wool over my eyes to make me think I was helping them, when in fact I was just the target of their investigation. I want to point out, as I came from a single-parent household, my father was never involved in my life in any aspect, and that also intersected with a different police tactic, the good cop, bad cop technique, in which over time I began to look up to the officer who was pretending to be my friend as a father figure. Eventually, they got me to agree to take a lie detector test. They said that they had some new information in the file. They wanted to share that with me, and that would allow me to be even more helpful to them. First, though, I would have to take and pass the polygraph. So the next day, rather than report to the high school, I instead went to the police station. Because it was a school day, my mother and grandmother with whom I lived, they had no idea that anything was wrong, and therefore they did not call around looking for me. But they drove me from Peekskill, which is in Westchester County, the suburbs in New York. They drove me 40 minutes away by car to the town of Brewster, which is in Putnam County, which meant that I was no longer able to leave on my own, instead totally dependent upon the police. There were 3 cops that came with me from Peekskill to Putnam. They put me in the car by myself with the good cop. But then there was also the polygraphist who was a Putnam County Sheriff's investigator, but he was dressed like a civilian, never identified himself as law enforcement, never read me my rights. I had no attorney present. They didn't give me anything to eat the entire time I was there. He gave me a 4-page brochure which explained how the polygraph worked, but there was a lot of big words in it that I didn't understand. But I figured I was there to help the police. So what does it matter? Let's just get on with it. From there, he put me in a small room. He gave me countless cups of coffee. Seems pretty clear in hindsight, the purpose of giving me the coffee was to get me nervous. And then he literally wired me up to the machine. And then he launched his third-degree tactic. So he invaded my personal space. He raised his voice at me. He kept asking me the same questions over and over again. And as each hour passed, my fear increased in proportion to the time. He kept that up for 6.5 to 7 hours. Towards the end, made a statement. He said, "What do you mean you didn't do it? You just told me through the test result that you did. We just want you to verbally confirm it." And at that point, that really shot my fear through the roof. And that's when the officer who had been pretending to be my friend, he came in the room and told me that the other officers were going to harm me, that he was holding them off, but he couldn't do so any longer, that I had to help myself. Then he further said, "Just tell them what they want to hear. You can go home afterwards. You're not going to be arrested." Being young, naive, frightened, 16 years old, I wasn't thinking about the long term. I was just concerned with my safety in the moment. I was in fear of my life because the fact that I didn't know where I was and that nobody else knew where I was either loomed rather large in my mind. There was this push-pull dynamic in play. On one hand, the possibility of harm, and on the other, this false life preserver that he threw me. So I took the out which he offered, and I made up a story based on the information that I was given that day and in the 6 weeks run up to it. By the time it was all said and done, I had collapsed on the floor in a fetal position, crying uncontrollably. The interrogation was not videotaped. It was not audio taped. There was no signed confession. And so when they eventually came to court, the cops left the illegal things which they engaged in, the threat and false promise, out of their story. So I realized then immediately that it was a coerced confession because I knew that I was not willingly giving the confession. I was giving it in response to the threat which had been conveyed to me.
Absolutely petrifying, Jeff, for such a young boy to go through all of that. It's astounding, really, hearing the story back. And a lot of people assume that wrongful convictions are rare accidents. From your experience, what do most people misunderstand about how innocent people end up in prison?
A number of misconceptions. First of all, it's not rare. It is per the National Registry of Exonerations, which documents the exonerations across the United States. From 1989 forward, there have been more than 3,300 documented exonerations. So the people that are exonerated, such as myself, were really the lucky ones that have made it out. You can only count the exonerations. You can't actually count the wrongful convictions because if you could, then we would be able to identify the people and they would be released. So that's one thing. Another thing is, well, if you didn't do that, you did something else. That's another misconception. And then people think, well, this could only happen to you in certain walks of life or you put yourself in harm's way. You know, what were you in the wrong place at the wrong time? You know, but I think that that's also another common misconception. I'll say people think that somebody innocent would never confess. They think, well, if I didn't commit a crime, I'd never confess. But first of all, false confessions have happened in 29% of the DNA-proven wrongful convictions. And while adults have given coerced false confessions, vulnerable populations are youth and people with mental health issues, which I was youth. You know, until you're really in that situation, there's really no way to understand what the pressure is when you're in an interrogation room and you're cut off from morale and support and friends and family, and you get worn down over time, and how at the end, all you want, a commonality in many of the false confessions, is that all the person being questioned wants is for it to stop. No one's thinking about the long-term implications.
And what specific changes do you recommend to prevent coerced confessions, especially for minors in police interrogation settings?
All interrogations should be completely videotaped from beginning to end. The camera should be focused on both the interview subject as well as law enforcement. Police should not be allowed to lie to suspects because lying to suspects which is allowed, by the way, which most people would be shocked to learn. Lying to suspects claiming to have evidence that doesn't exist is inherently coercive. And of course, there's the Youth Interrogation Act. So I'm myself and other advocates were advocating for the police deception bill I just described, videotaping interrogations from beginning to end, because New York law mandates that the police have to record, but there's exceptions for homicide, sex offenses, drug cases. We want to shut those exceptions down. We want recording in all scenarios. And lastly, the Youth Interrogation Act, which we also advocate for, if passed, that law would mandate that 17-year-olds and kids younger than that would have a non-waivable right to counsel. They would have to speak to an attorney for that attorney to explain their rights to them so that they can then decide if they want to waive those rights and speak to the police without an attorney. And that would be in recognition that most kids don't understand their rights. I mean, reflecting back to my own experience with law enforcement, I never understood what my rights are. I was 16. My education was limited. Then the police being allowed to lie to me, they had me believing that, I'm assisting them in the investigation when in fact I'm their target. So that placed my understanding of my rights even further removed. And every time they came to that portion of the Miranda warnings, which said anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law, I never understood what that meant. My mind went to what I saw on television, different civil court contexts. And I remember thinking to myself, court, what are you talking about? We're not going to court. So that law would prevent the police from overreaching youth, which
Mm.
is what happened to me. Let me just point out the public safety aspect of this. A wrongful conviction is devastating to the individual. When you send the wrong person to prison, you're not just sending them, you're also sending their family. But in a larger sense, it is a public safety issue because each time an innocent person is sent to prison, the perpetrator is free to strike again. And as we covered earlier, that is what happened in my case.
Absolutely devastating. And I wasn't aware about the police lying. It's really shocking. Your foundation has helped to free 15 innocent people. What does the exoneration process actually look like behind the scenes, especially in cases where DNA evidence is not available?
That's a great question. And just for our audience, for context, DNA evidence is only available in 10% of all serious felony cases. So most of the time a case can't be resolved that way. So behind the scenes in a non-DNA case, 90% of the cases, what it looks like is that we're looking for alternative suspects. We're looking for similar crimes in nearby areas where if we think any of the witnesses were not truthful when they testified, then we re-interview witnesses. Sometimes new witnesses bubble to the surface that weren't known before. Times misconduct by law enforcement or forensic scientists have bubbled to the surface in some other unrelated case. We look and see where any junk science is used. Those are things that sound scientific that have been accepted in court for decades, but in fact are not scientific because there's no underlying studies. We can't know what the error rate is. So things like tire tracks, prints, marks, blood testing is legit, but that can only narrow down to a blood type. There's 3 different blood types, and that's not a discriminating enough type of test. So certainly if a conviction was obtained, at least in part by a junk science, that's definitely a point for us to attack the case. We do file freedom of information request documents, and sometimes documents that were supposed to have been turned over before trial but were buried are turned over, and so that may furnish a new investigative lead. But we send a questionnaire out to applicants, which they fill out. We collect certain limited legal documents and we cross-reference their answers to the documents, and then we look a second time and we analyze what was used as evidence of guilt. So this is where the DNA really provides invaluable data. So the DNA exonerations give us an unassailable pile of data so that we can know what are the red flags that a confession may be false, that an identification may be mistaken, that an informant may be lying. So we bring that knowledge of what those red flags are while we're evaluating a case, because part of our evaluation, and it's a twofold part. Firstly, we're looking at what was used as evidence of guilt. We're looking for the presence of any of those red flags. And secondarily, we're looking at what are the investigative directions to go on in this case. You're going to look at the record to determine make our educated guess as to guilt or innocence. But that's not how we win. That
Mm.
just motivates us to take the case because the court's not going to allow us to relitigate the case. We're gonna have to come up with some previously unknown evidence of innocence that probably would have led to a different outcome. And so we use all those things and we look for what directions there are to go in. And then at the end, we ask ourselves, first of all, if all of these directions that we've identified, if they all broke right for the applicant, would that constitute enough new evidence? What are the odds that it would break right? What is the amount of time and financial resources that it would take to do the field work on those cases? So that's how we accept or reject a case. I don't decree from on high whether we're taking a case or not. There's a case analyst, and in order for us to accept or reject a case, we it has to be a consensus. So if there's no consensus, then there's no decision. The case just remains pending until we can decide. But all of that's just the prep work. That's not the actual work on the case. Get to the field, now we are going to run down all of those lines of investigation and on DNA case. And in a DNA case, we're going to seek to get testing things like seminal fluid, blood, saliva, wetting item where somebody may have sweated into. Only if we get some new evidence, we'll then file either in a conviction review unit, which is a certain department in the district attorney's office that looks for and reviews claims of innocence. We'll decide, will we file there or we instead file in court, just file a post-conviction motion. That's when legal research and writing takes place, litigate.
Very, very thorough, in-depth process. And so you've dedicated so much of your life and your work to this. You've delivered hundreds of presentations across the US and internationally. What do you hope that people take away from hearing you speak live as a keynote speaker?
That wrongful convictions can happen to anyone. My story is this example of one case. And my favorite part of the presentations after I get finished with my story is when I get to share the policy issues, like what are the systemic deficiencies that lead to wrongful conviction? What are the legislative changes that we need in order to address those deficiencies? Because most of the systemic deficiencies that have led to wrongful convictions in the past remain largely unaddressed by policy change, by changes in the law. And so people could be wrongfully convicted just as easily now as they have been in the past. So that's the main thing that I try to convey. But that's when it's a criminal justice reform / wrongful conviction reform oriented talk. There are other times where I tell my story, but the focal point is not to go over policy changes. It's more of a inspirational story, never give up type of genre. My favorite aspect of that is a formula that I've come up with, reflecting on the arc of my life, my walk of life, which I share with people. And I tell them, while I came up with this as a result of being wrongfully convicted and exonerated, its application is not limited, to that. And that equation is, have a goal, have a realistic plan. Because who wants to carry out a plan that's not realistic, that you don't think can work? So a realistic plan is a plan that you could look at 3 or 4 different ways and ultimately conclude, well, yeah, I could see how this might work. Be flexible, because remember, the plan is not the goal. The goal is the goal. The plan is just how to get there. No excuses. There might be reasons why something is harder to do, but no reason why it can't be done. You just have to want it enough and work for it enough, which is the next point, which is work really hard. I'm not a pie in the sky person. I don't think everything's going to be okay just because. I think that you have to work really, really hard to put yourself in a position for a miracle to happen or for someone to open a door for you. And then also never give up. So when I reach moments where I feel like I can't continue anymore, I say to myself, this might be the key moment right here. I might have been on the verge of a breakthrough, but because I quit, it's not going to happen. So even though I feel like I can't go on anymore, I'm going to anyway, just to see what happens on the other side. And then once you cross that bridge, reach back and help somebody else across us in the same position. I've seen people that are discriminated against, that I've seen people who've faced racism. I've seen homicide victims that now engage in advocacy. I've seen people that have overcome drug habits who now work as drug counselors, people who used to be homeless that are now working with the homeless population. I've seen formerly incarcerated people who now are working with at-risk youth. So I've seen women who've been victims of domestic violence, and now they work with domestic violence population. So I know that this is true. So I share that. And then I also ask people to think about, just to contextualize their difficulties, their problems, their challenges. Not to say that those aren't real, but when compared to, I've had many people tell me, well, look, I thought I had problems. But when I think about your story, they shrink quite a bit. And I realize that they are manageable. I can overcome them. So I like convey that hope. So that's the focal point in a never give up type of story. But I've also done presentations where I'm focused on one other aspect of criminal justice reform. So I like to share knowledge. It's cathartic. It makes my suffering count for something in it, and it makes a difference. I'm not an angry person. I realized after my first week that this being angry that first week that was destroying me. That I want to enjoy my life as much as I can. Can't do that if I'm simultaneously angry or bitter. I lost so much already as is. Why would I want to, in effect, lose the rest of my life? It's not like I'd be impacting any of the people who had a hand in what happened to me. If I was to be angry or bitter, I would really be the only loser in that scenario. And the vehicle that allows me to actualize that is I take the energy that I feel and I channel it into the advocacy work that I do. I have the inner peace about me. I know for sure that I'm doing what I'm supposed to do, what I'm meant to do in this world.
Wow. Did you say 1 week, Jeff? So you were wrongly imprisoned for 16 years, but you were only angry for 1 week. Did I hear that correctly?
You did. I'll tell you real quick the backstory on that. So shortly before I was exonerated, which happened like all at once. So I'd gotten transferred to a different prison, and I saw on the television that somebody else had been exonerated like very shortly before I was. And he was asked if he was angry, and he said he wasn't angry. And I thought to myself, well, that's just the silliest thing ever. Okay. But at the end of that week is when it dawned on me, well, actually, that wasn't so silly after all. He was the one that was correct. I was the one that made mistakes. So that's how I was able to, I remembered him, and that's how I was able to like change things up. And I feel like that was really a key intervention moment in my life.
That's amazing. And it was a decision?
It was a decision, yes.
Really powerful. Thank you for sharing that. So work hard, no excuses, never give up.
Correct. Have a goal and have a realistic plan.
Fantastic. And what can listeners do if they want to support the work of freeing innocent people and preventing future wrongful convictions?
Right. So the foundation at present, we have 13 active cases that we're working on. That's at least 5 too many. We are working on policy changes, not just in New York, but also in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania is one of 10 states that don't compensate the wrongfully convicted. So that's our policy goal there. And we're also active in California, where we're building support for the Commission on Prosecutor Conduct, which is an independent oversight board that could investigate allegations of prosecutorial misconduct that would mirror the bill that we were able to pass in New York. So if people wanted to help, we do have our crowdfunding page on the Patreon website. People can put in their Google search bar, Patreon, Deskovic Foundation. So dream with me for a minute, Cassie. What if there were 25,000 people that were to sacrifice $3 to $5 on a recurring monthly basis to free innocent people? Who would miss that from their pocket? But if that many people were doing that, we would have close to $1 million in revenue. That additional funds, we would be able to hire additional attorneys, paralegals, investigators, other essential personnel. We would be able to work on freeing even more innocent people that we're currently able to do. And we would also be able to pursue policy changes in more than just those 3 states. So that is a definite concrete way that everybody can help. But beyond that, network. So my biggest challenge as the founder of a nonprofit organization is that I didn't make it in business 10, 20, 30, 40 years with a cohort of people that I have credibility and cachet with that I can now turn to, and they'll all support. So I need third parties that can connect me with people that they know. And just for a short conversation, here's who I am, here's my education, here's my body of work, here's the organization's mission, here's our track record, here's the metrics that we could hit if we had additional funding. Is this something that interests you, or it's not? Appreciate your time in either scenario. So help with the networking. If people work at a corporation that engages in corporate philanthropy, we ask that people just put us on decision makers' radar. Maybe there's podcasters or traditional media members that you can bring the story to the attention of. So certainly the exposure, helps to bring light to the issue of wrongful conviction and our organization in particular. I do speaking engagements, as we spoke about, and I have the honorariums made out to the organization, so it's a minor income stream. So again, just floating the idea to somebody. And lastly, if there's someone that has some kind of talent or skill, as long as there's an application in what we're doing in one way or another, the donated services can be very, very helpful as well.
Thank you so much for sharing. We will add your links below. And Jeffrey, thank you so much for sharing your powerful story with us. I'm sure there's so many takeaways that our listeners can take. And we are really looking forward to working with you on your thought leadership journey and your continued success to help more people and to free more people.
Thank you very much for having me. This was a very enjoyable interview.
Thank you so much. And thank you for listening.